Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi, numbers up music YouTuber. Because as of the time of recording this part one of this series, or I don't know what, like 11 or something. It's the first part of the ride part. Has 3 whole views. So read it and weep. Ozymandias once said, "Look upon me, ye mighty, and despair," because I am absolutely getting loaded, stacking my guap to the ceiling because everyone and their mother wants to listen to Duke talk about shoegaze for some reason. But depressing things aside, all 3 of you watching this series and still watching it, I've got a little treat for you because we're starting it today with a continuation of the little electronic detour we had last time, which makes me think at some point in the future I might just be covering more electronic tinged shoegaze in some future series if I'm unlucky enough to want to do more shoegaze. But it is the summer, so I want to incorporate these warm feelings, but here in the south it's rather humid, and what better to cool down and relax and feel utopic with than a little band known as Sweet Trip with an album known as Velocity Design Comfort. Yes, that is the album we are talking about today. I have been hyped to talk about this one for probably 2 years at this point. I have barely mentioned it on this channel. I've barely mentioned it at all, and yet I've been knowing about it for 4 years easily, and I finally get to talk about it. And the cool thing about this album is it's one of the few albums on this chart that, due to extremity, is like kind of not really shoegaze anymore a little bit. If you talked to me 4 years ago, or many people 4 years ago, they would be like, that is a shoegaze classic. And let's be honest here, this album is fantastic. It's amazing. It's very shoegazy. It's full of dream pop and full of really hazy, washed out guitar tones, and it sounds amazing. But above all else, this is an IDM album, which is a genre I have mentioned probably 0 times on this channel. It's something I know very little about, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But what you get with this album is such an interesting twist on the classic sort of rock bend of shoegaze, where you make it so glitchy that it's borderline unrecognizable from shoegaze at points. Several of these songs can stretch to 10 minutes of ambient. They could last for minutes of glitchy elements, or like a track like Disco can be just verse, chorus, with just a little bit of glitchiness. It's really just hazy, shoegazy pop music at that point, but it's at the top of its league. This could be one of the best songs off of any other album I've discovered on this chart, and it would still shine. Every track's progression is so great and so immersive that it really adds such an interesting bend to this that nothing else really does. It is deep, complex, and gorgeous, and you will find something new to enjoy about this album every time you listen to it. Every track is brimming with new elements. It helps that this album is like over an hour long. This thing is a behemoth, several tracks over 10 minutes in length. And due to the high contrast between genre switch-ups constantly, one, they are actually blended together rather well, and 2, because of said contrast, this thing feels highly emotional. So I could talk for a lot longer about this thing if I actually cared to give it another listen again and again, but I own a copy of this on CD, so that just goes to show I really like it. It's great. You should all listen to it. It's actually totally worth your time. Now, with the electronic influence we've been looking at, if you want to add some trip hop, we go into a band called Bowery Electric with an album called Beat, another experimental electronic shoegaze album, one that people discuss and one that is totally worth discussing because it's really, really interesting. This one also takes a serious dosage of slowcore as well. Not to traditional indie rock slowcore, but this old, really laid back hip hop groove type trip hop thing is slowed down to an almost ambient pace. It kind of reminds me of the sort of nocturnal nature of a band. Boren and Der Club of Gore. That was the thing I was thinking of. I forgot the name because it's a mouthful. But if you want that really lethargic sort of nocturnal nature, that's a band that is kind of similar, especially Midnight Radio. Except this is a lot more entertaining than an album like that. This is not so hell-bent on ambient. This is not so hell-bent on very minimalist structures here, as this thing has a very subtle, almost krautrock approach where it just revolves over itself and it clicks on and on and on in a way that feels rather cool, like something like Massive Attack. Honestly, it's an album I cannot believe that it isn't British. It feels distinctly British. Now, this is an album that is really hard to describe for too long in general because it is just a brick. It is very one note, a very singular approach, and yet a pretty unique one. It's 100% vibe. It works as a very excellent ambient piece as an entire album. It's an incredibly cozy album. It feels like warm rain. The combination of well-blended synth tones and minimalist guitar makes this something quite unique for the genre conventions. Yeah, this album's very different, even a bit drony. Something you guys should definitely check out. It's really great. It's one of the most unique albums on this whole chart, and there's not a lot of stuff like this out there. This is probably a band I should listen to more of because they have other albums other than this, but this is certainly something worth checking out. Now, going all the way back to Bethany Curve, we add more ambient with a band called Fonts, and this is with their album High Expectations, Low Results. And to me, this is an album most comparable to that M83 album I discussed earlier, except it's got a little bit more dynamics and a little bit more legible vocals. It's a little less noisy overall, and it's definitely softer overall. And there is a point in the track list where it eventually ditches almost all of the electronics and goes for a much thicker, more sparse, almost slowcore approach. And man, is it a bummer. There is some serious pain in this album. It's a feeling that comes as a bit of a surprise, but it is very gorgeous. Everything here sounds completely full. It reveals itself as something deep and beautiful, as well as incredibly vast along its pretty massive track length. Not to mention, it sounds great. It's definitely another one of those albums that is like a brick wall for almost the entire time, but it sounds really interesting. It's kind of reminds me of like the Drive soundtrack if it would be better and a little less plasticky. And if you want even more ambient, we go into a little band known as Love Lies Crushing with an album called Blow Eyelash Wish, their most popular album, debatably their best as well, and one that I find very interesting due to the sheer amount of noise on this thing. It kind of reminds me of that I'm a Lake of Burning Orchids record, although this is less power electronicsy. It has a very avant-garde tinge to the whole thing due to how there's almost no drums on this whole thing. Very little at all. It's also incredibly thick. The vocals are also some of the most washed out you'll ever hear in the genre, borderline unrecognizable for most of the tracks. And I don't mean like Cocteau Twins. I like where you could tell there are vocals. Several of these tracks you have no idea if there are vocals. And as drony and monolithic as this whole thing is, there's a certain amount of discernibility between each of these tracks, enough to stand out on their own. But overall, this thing is thick, heavy, and intoxicating, which are a bunch of things I like in my shoegaze. And it does all of those. That's like its whole point. So I think it's great. Everything it tries to do is everything I enjoy. So definitely give it a listen. But if you want more ambient related shoegaze material, we go into a little known man who named Jeffrey Cantu Ledesma. How do you pronounce his name? I sure hope that's similar, but I don't care if I'm right or wrong in all necessarily. Yeah, the album title, Love is a Stream. I wish I cared a little more to actually address it properly, but that's it. It's a lot like what we just discussed, but a little tiny bit different. This one is lighter in the noise quality, and it feels like it's falling apart the whole time. It's just not as heavy or crushing as Love Lies Crushing. This is certainly an album you have to crank just to have it swallow you, because its soft textures are something to sort of embrace rather than get swallowed by just the sheer emotional weight of the whole thing. But it does have some emotional melancholy that kind of reminds me of Have a Nice Life. The vocals are, again, minimal, and the drums are absent. It's no Love Lies Crushing, but it's certainly some solid ambient, so I have to say it's good. It just kind of doesn't do what I think it could do, basically. It doesn't have that sort of fringe insanity aspect that I like in my experimental shoegaze. So yeah, it's listenable for sure. And then if you want more, we have Thought Forms with their album Ghost Mountain, which threw me off for a while because Ghost Mountain sounds more like a band name. And also, this album shouldn't be on this part of the chart. It's a lot more like Chiron Ursa than any of this ambient stuff. It's got sort of a krautrock, space rock bend to the whole thing. There's even a post-metal bend to this whole thing, a serious, low, bassy rumble. It reminds me a bit of bands like Hum. The track Burn Me Clean is especially resemblant. It has that really heavy, spacious aspect to it. So the distinction between rock, shoegaze, and a more ambient style of shoegaze is a really cool concept, but it just comes off as too disjointed. So I think this album's okay. I don't really have that much else to say about it, although its actual just intrinsic approach is outwardly flawed. And if you want full-on ambient, we have an act known as Grouper with an album called AIA, Alien Observer. And I don't really feel like talking about it for very long. It's great. It's great. All I'm going to say, it is one of the single best textural experiences your ears will ever have. But it's surprisingly some very solid, really, really slow pop music. So That's the short end of it. And if you go back to Bethany Curve's Flexin', and then you want a little bit more alternative rock, that's the final section of today. We're doing a whole alternative dive. But I'd feel remiss to not mention Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream. Not a full-on shoegaze album, but you'll see that it has some relevance on this chart because that's a pretty shoegazy alternative rock grunge album there. I think it's grunge. I don't need to hear any of you guys say otherwise, but I mean, it's a good one. Songs like Mayonnaise are excellent, but I don't need to talk about that anymore because we have a band called Adorable with an album called Against Perfection. You get a classic, clean-cut sound, very poppy structure. It reminds me a bit of the Pixies in all honesty, and the vocalist is certainly passable, if a bit too British for my taste. And there's some really solid bass work. It adds some actual flavor to the whole thing. And overall, the riffs in general are pretty good. They have a decent chord structure to them. They're energetic enough. I like cut number 2, and the track Still Life is pretty excellent, actually kind of emotional. But overall, the album kind of fails to deliver on just a whole track length. It just has a few songs that really don't do the same for me as some of the other songs do. But it's certainly good. You know, if you like pop rock that reminds you of the Pixies, this is something to listen to. And if you want it to be even more alternative, we have a band called Catherine Wheel with their album Ferment, which means we are officially in alt writing territory, which actually means solid songwriting. Now, because of its sort of indie alt approach, you have something very humble and emotionally charged, which I find rather interesting for shoegaze. And the whole thing is coupled with this really bold intensity, as if there is nothing at all to lose. And the vocal reverb is just like Red House Painters. It is pretty insane. The emotional aspect goes so much deeper than anything here. It's a very interesting take for shoegaze for sure. It's absolutely rock-based, but groovy and riff-forward, even danceable at points. I think this album is totally great. It's definitely one a lot of people can get into, but it has an emotional aspect that a lot of alt-rock or pop in general just doesn't engage with. So this thing is totally acceptable by every means, something very enjoyable. And our final split-off portion of the chart, if you want it to be more intense, we have a little-known band known as Mass of the Fermenting Dregs. That's how it's spelled. With their self-titled album, this is a band from Japan that engages in a lot more weird J-rock, post-hardcore isms than anything else. So if that's how you enjoy your music overall, if you like that, then you'll like this. I do like how Japanese music overall, at least when it engages in Western-style pop music or Western-style any music that isn't modern classical, it has a really interesting bend to the whole thing. It's like their rock music is adjacent to post-hardcore because it has so much going on there. Can be inherently pretty experimental with bands like Boris. Hell Merzbow is one of Japan's leading exports in terms of music. And the whole visual kei thing interacting with melodic death metal is pretty crazy. Even Japanese black metal can be particularly emotional. So, and we've already talked about some Japanese shoegaze on this chart way back in the day. So this thing's got a lot to live up to because this thing is punky, up in your face, but it's fun. Overall, it's got a very, very warm tone to the whole thing, but it's not that shoegazy. The whole thing has just this really wide, vast level of distortion and even a bit of reverb crammed in there for good measure. And the female vocals add this sort of energy to the whole thing. She's a very solid singer as well. It's describing this as any one genre other than just J-rock is really hard to do. Certainly applying American standards to this thing, or just Western standards in general, is something you can do, but it feels kind of flawed. This thing is a very brief 30 minutes long, and track 4 is 9 of them. It's a very uneasy sort of post-rock leaning build. It's really interesting, definitely on the jammier side, definitely on the more intense upfront post-hardcore stuff. It is an easy highlight, but unfortunately it kind of overshadows some of the other tracks here, so it really makes me think this album is good. I feel like it needs to develop a little bit more than what it did, but that being said, it's certainly not a bad listen all the way through. And instead of that, we're going the other direction for more alternative with a band called Supercar with an album called 3 Out Change, which is almost 80 godforsaken minutes of jangle pop, including an ultra repetitive 12-minute long closer. This band is pretending to be like Oasis or something, but it is a very great vibe. The whole thing is chill throughout the entirety of its existence, but that's the thing. I don't really want to be chill for 80 minutes. I either want complete serenity or intensity. Chill is really something you can't rely on for an whole album. There's a very prominent bass tone that adds a whole lot of groove while the guitar is busy filling up the entirety of your ear holes, but it's It's groovy. It's got a cool sort of Ringo Death Star type vibe. That's a band I like a lot. And very rarely do I find an album that is so hindered by a language barrier for me in the listen, because this is also Japanese, if you can't tell by the album cover and the Japanese writing on it. But it's so poppy that I'm just like, I want to understand the how to sing this thing or what the words mean. But then again, Naki Kyoku by Boris, I probably just butchered how to pronounce that thing, but it's the Boris track everyone sends to everyone. That's catchy to me. That's catchier, and that song's like 12 minutes long. Meanwhile, this thing here, it's like I'm struggling to attach myself to it. So there's got to be some other flaw I'm not thinking of. But overall, you got some solid pop tunes, but some hookiness sort of in the riffs department. But the thing is good. It's too long. And with that, we are on our final album of this chart. That's like the 96th something album. We have spoken about so much shoegaze in this channel, and I don't know if I'm done. Maybe in a couple years I'll cover some other shoegaze chart, because believe me, this is not the only one. I've covered 2 black gaze charts at this point. I've covered this entire shoegaze chart. I've got a Japanese shoegaze chart. I've got a shoegaze chart that sounds like Sweet Trip. I've got an experimental shoegaze chart. I've got another whole omnibus shoegaze chart, which I will not be covering because I don't need another 120 albums on top of this 96. Besides, half of those are just on here as well. But what could be the last one? And it goes full-on alternative with shoegaze influence. This is an album called Carnivus by a band called Silver Sun Pickups, and it does something very unexpected. I mentioned a bit earlier about the alt-rock songwriting being something that's a big benefit here. Now, something you will not find a lot in shoegaze due to the level of feedback and distortion is actual quiet. And I don't mean like dreamier tracks or dream pop. I mean like actual legitimate quiet moments. Like even Dagger by Slowdive is a bit on the noisier side. But here's an album that has actual moments of silence in their songs because they have syncopation and grooviness, and yet the guitar tone is shoegazy. This thing is an alt-rock album through and through with phenomenal songwriting. Very catchy, great 2 vocalist setup, and a very punky nature to the whole thing, the way it just keeps you engaged the whole time, and yet some tracks that go to the avant-garde lengths of 6 minutes or so. It's actually the closer that reaches just a single second past 6 minutes that gets very noisy, which really shows you that this is a shoegaze album at the end of the day, and it's why it is just so enjoyable. This thing does everything that a rock album should. It just so happens to also be shoegaze, which is something I like a lot. I think this one's great. It is a great listen. You could listen to it with a lot of people. It's a lot more accessible. It's a good way to get into shoegaze, not from a historical sense, but from a new listener sense. And I feel like a lot of people should learn to not gatekeep by doing that. Like, for example, if someone's into Cradle of Filth, you'd say, hey, maybe you would enjoy Summoning. Or if someone listens to deathcore, you'd say, hey, maybe you'd like Skinless or Cryptopsy. Or if someone's like into Deftones way too much or Smashing Pumpkins, you could say, hey, what about I Am a Lake of Burning Orchids? That's pretty cool too. But oh my goodness, that's enough shoegaze for 1 year. Maybe I'll talk about some more at the album of the year list next year, or pull some other shoegaze chart around. But that's it. We're done. Jen made this thumbnail. Jen's in the description below. I made this video. He's in the description down below. And his Discord is where all of you should be, even if you're not there already. But if you did like this video, I'd appreciate an actual like and subscribe. Helps me. Any comments, questions, or concerns underneath the description below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. And yeah, that's about it. Have a good day. Bye.